Alrighty, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Pretty excited for this webinar this afternoon on the impacts of aquatic invasive species and other complex interactions on Pacific salmon. Um, just like to acknowledge we're all tuning in from many different parts of the province and from the traditional and ancestral and unceded territories of many different bands and nations. I'm joining all of you from Coquitlam, where I'm very thankful for the Coquitlam First Nation who continue to live on these lands and waters and care for them. As a matter of fact, Coquitlam in English means red fish up the river, which describes a unique run of sockeye salmon that once ran plentiful in the Coquitlam River. So it's timely we're speaking salmon. Um, I'll just briefly describe what's happening today, and then I'll let our fantastic presenters get stuck in here. Very excited to have two very knowledgeable experts joining us today. First, we have Amalis Riera Vuibert from the Provincial. She's the Provincial Aquatic Invasive Fauna Specialist with the Ministry of Water, Lands, and Resource Stewardship, who's going to give us an overview on the aquatic invasive species fauna of BC. And secondly, we have Dr. Dan Selbie, who is DFO's Lakes Research Program, is in DFO's Lakes Research Program in the science branch out of the Cultus Lake Salmon Research Lab. So we'll hear from both speakers. There's a Q&A option. So if you do have any questions, please do type them in there. And then after both speakers are done, I'll walk through those and we'll answer some questions. Yeah. I just do a couple intro slides just on the council for anyone isn't too familiar, but we've been working for close to 20 years addressing the threat of invasive species in BC. Our focus tends to extend beyond local boundaries. We encompassing education, outreach, and training, and cross-border collaboration across Canada and internationally. And we all know that collaboration is pretty key to successfully managing invasives. As an organization, we prioritize in organizing and uniting efforts to strive and spearhead behavior change. This includes sort of coordinating research and sharing findings through conferences, forums, and webinars like this one. And we're also a founding member and co-chair of the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. So this allows us to collaborate at a national level and pool our experience with other like-minded organizations. So, and ultimately our mission is to take action to build healthy landscapes and communities, focusing on education, promoting responsible practices, all to spread awareness and knowledge and prevent the further spread of invasives. So, yeah, at that, I'll go off screen here and allow Amalis to take it away.
Thanks, Nick. Let's see. All right. I would like to start off by acknowledging with gratitude and respect that I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people, as well as the Songhees and Esquimalt people in Victoria, BC. Come on. So what are invasive species? Species that are not native to the province or are outside of their natural distribution and can negatively impact British Columbia's environment, people, and/or economy. This definition covers everything from plants, vertebrates, invertebrates, fungi, and even microbes, often as introduced diseases. Some examples of high-profile invasive species in BC include zebra and quagga mussels, northern pike, Spartina, Japanese beetle, and white nose syndrome. Why are we concerned? Invasive species are the second largest threat to species and ecosystem after habitat loss. In addition, many invasive species can have significant socioeconomic impacts, including loss of productivity to agriculture, aquaculture, and forestry, impacts on infrastructure, hazards to human health and safety, and degradation of recreational areas such as parks. For example, European fire ants could impose annual damages of $100 million to public and private property. Here's how we coordinate management and prevention of invasive species at a provincial level. The Inter-Ministry Invasive Species Working Group begins together several BC government ministries. Our overarching goals are to prevent the establishment of new invasive species infestation, reduce the socioeconomic and environmental impacts of existing invasive species, and provide the framework and capacity for the ongoing management of invasive species. The Inter-Ministry Invasive Species Working Group, also known as IMISWIG, has two subcommittees, the Soil and Invasive Species Working Group and the Early Detection and Rapid Response Advisory Committee. EDRR species are invasive species that are either not known to be in BC or they are present in limited amounts. We manage these species by following several steps in the invasive species EDRR plan, which you can find on our website. The plan provides detailed directions on the decisions and actions required to address new incursions in BC. The process involves an extensive review of the species in the form of a risk assessment. And the management objective for EDRR species is eradication. Given that we are a diverse group of people across ministries, different groups of invasive species are managed by different people. I focus on aquatic invasive fauna. Emily Lomas deals with terrestrial and semi-aquatic invasive fauna. And the invasive plant program is responsible for terrestrial and aquatic invasive plants. Emily and I are in the Ministry of Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship, and the invasive plant program is in the Ministry of Forests. Today, I will only talk about aquatic invasive animals. If you would like more information on aquatic invasive plants, please contact the invasive plant program in the Ministry of Forests. And if you would like more information on semi-aquatic invasive animals, please contact Emily Lomas. Now I'm going to give a few examples of priority aquatic invasive animal species. The western mosquito fish is prohibited in BC under the Wildlife Act. It has so far been listed in the prevent category, but has now been found in BC at two locations, at Grafton Lake on Bowen Island and at Fish Trap Creek in Abbotsford. Even though mosquito fish are considered sensitive to colder water temperatures, there have been documentations of this species surviving and spreading through Nebraska and Missouri, where annual mean temperatures are similar to regions of southern BC. A risk assessment for this species is currently being prepared. The white cloud mountain minnow is also prohibited in BC under the Wildlife Act. It is provincially listed in the prevent category, and even though there have been no known observations of this species in natural BC water bodies, there have been two recent instances of pet stores selling them in the Lower Mainland. Conservation officers were able to respond and seize the fish in both instances. If released into the wild, white cloud mountain minnows could potentially establish and spread into regions of BC. In the past, the Vuibert crayfish has been listed in the prevent category. There have been historical reports in southeastern BC in the Kootenay region, and it was confirmed this past summer in Lillian and Wuyi lakes. This is not unexpected due to the historical reports and its presence in surrounding jurisdictions. A risk assessment is also being prepared for this species. Whirling disease affects juvenile salmonid fish, including trout and whitefish. It is caused by a microscopic parasite which infects fish through their skin. Although there's no risk to human health, the parasite can be lethal to juvenile salmonids. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency has received final test results that have confirmed the presence of whirling disease at Vuibert Lake in Yoho National Park. Following the confirmed positive detection, the province of BC has been working closely with Parks Canada and the CFIA regarding next steps, which include identifying high priority areas and identifying appropriate methods for surveillance and testing, as well as focusing efforts on outreach and education to promote the clean, drain, dry messaging. We strongly encourage boaters, anglers, and recreational users to always clean, drain, dry all equipment and boats following every use when leaving a water body to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species and diseases. Additional information on whirling disease can be found on our Provincial website, and the link is provided on the bottom of the slide. Now I'm going to talk about the Invasive Mussel Defense Program. The province has been implementing this program since 2015 in partnership with the Conservation Officer Service, program funding partners, and neighboring jurisdictions across Canada and the US, with prevention activities focused on watercraft inspection stations, checking boats coming into BC at key entry points, early detection, lake monitoring in priority lakes across the province, and the Clean Drain Dry public outreach campaign. For the 2023 season, 43 inspectors operated across 6 watercraft inspection stations and 2 roving inspection crews. As you can see on the map, the watercraft inspection stations are located at key border crossings along the Alberta and US borders. Most inspection stations were operational from April 1st to October 31st. In 2023, inspection crews completed approximately 21,000 inspections, and during the inspections, 155 watercraft were identified as high risk for either invasive mussels or other aquatic invasive species. Of these, 14 watercraft were confirmed to have invasive mussels. These watercrafts came from Ontario, 10 of them, Manitoba, Michigan, Nevada, and South Carolina. Lake monitoring is a critical first step for early detection of invasive mussels. The province continues to partner with the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation to administer grants to community organizations and collect water samples in priority water bodies across the province. A total of 867 water samples were collected from 83 priority water bodies. All samples tested negative for invasive mussels. To date, there have been no reported introductions of live zebra or quagga mussels in BC waterways. I want to highlight all the partners are listed on the map and acknowledge that these partnerships have been critical to the delivery of this program. So what can you do to prevent the spread of invasive species? I'm going to show you our provincial website where you can access resources such as invasive species alert sheet. I'll go over our reporting tools, including our Report Invasives mobile app, and I will talk about education and outreach efforts to promote the key messages of clean, drain, dry, and don't let it loose. Here's our provincial website, which has lots of great resources. You can view our EDRR plans, and you can also access our provincial reporting tools, which include our provincial reporting app. If you go to the Priority Invasive Species tab, you can view the provincial priority species list as a PDF. You can also view priority invasive species by taxonomic group on the left side menu. For example, if you select fish, you can view all freshwater invasive fish species by priority category. And this is where you can access our alert sheets by clicking on the hyperlinked fish names. Alert sheets include information on species ID, biology, potential lookalikes, risk factors, and status in BC. We're working on adding new ones as much as possible and updating old ones periodically. If you would like additional ID information on prohibited aquatic invasive species, you can find this guide in the Resources and Publications section. Prohibited species are invasive species that are regulated in BC. It's illegal to possess, breed, release, sell, or transport these fishes in BC. If you navigate back to the main invasive species page, you can access an introduction to invasive species online training created by BC Parks. As for reporting tools, we highly encourage anyone who comes across an invasive species in BC to report it via any of our reporting platforms, which is either the Report Invasives mobile app, an online form, or via email. Please remember that if you want to send an email, you may contact me to report aquatic invasive animals, Emily Lomas for semi-aquatic invasive animals, and the Invasive Plant Program for aquatic invasive plants. Another reminder is that we only deal with freshwater aquatic invasive species. For marine invasive species, such as the European green crab, please contact DFO. And for invasive mussels, please call the RAP line. Ideally, a report will include the following: photos with a preference for close-ups and high resolution, location with geographical coordinates if possible, species name, and date observed. The Report Invasives app can be used to report invasive species observations from any smartphone. You can search by species and submit photos and details of suspected species observations, and the reports go directly to our provincial specialists. And we do receive important reports of priority species every year through the app. For example, last season we received over 2,900 reports, which greatly increased our understanding of on-the-ground impacts. Clean, drain, dry is a key message that is promoted to boaters and anglers to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species that are currently in some parts of BC and not in others. It's important to clean, drain, dry boats, but also gear, because aquatic invasive species can be found in mud attached to gear and equipment. If you are bringing your boat from outside of BC, please contact the program through this email, which is monitored by all the provincial inspectors and program staff who will determine if inspection and potential decontamination is required based on the risk. Don't let it loose is another key message that is promoted to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species in BC. This one is specific to pets, and they pose significant impacts to our native species. It is illegal to transport and release live fish into BC's lakes or streams. Persons convicted for the illegal movement of aquatic invasive species could be fined up to $200,000 and or receive a prison term of up to 2 years. And that's all I have for an overview. So I'm happy to take questions, and I believe the questions will come after Dan's presentation.
Do you want me to just take it away, Nick?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, please go right ahead. Thanks. Thanks, Amalis.
Right. Yeah. All right. Is that showing up on your end, folks? And you can hear me okay? No.
We can hear you, but we can't see your screen.
Not happening yet? Okay, thank you. Let's try this again.
There, we can see it now.
Awesome. And you're seeing the talk, I hope?
Yeah, there we can see just the presentation now. That's perfect.
Great. All right, well, so the sort of sciencey piece today is an integrated look at some of the work we've been doing on Cultus Lake and trying to draw attention to the major drivers of ecological change in the system. Just to give you an estimate of how important this is to society. It's estimated over $100 million a year coming to the economy from over 3 million visitors to the lake per year. So it's a major asset for the Lower Mainland. It's, you know, tied to many different values. Of course, I get involved when it has to do with species at risk and salmon. But Amalis and I are both part of a larger process to try and suppress the invasion of smallmouth bass, which is ongoing within Cultus Lake. And so my intention today is kind of lay this complex background because it's really been, you know, illustrative to me that you know, when you try to go after some of these environmental issues, it really becomes super complex, particularly when you're working in urban or peri-urban environments like we are in the Eastern Fraser Valley. Like the volume of people, the inner use of land use, the diversity of land use uses is large, and so one of the key themes here is it really does take a village to resolve some of these major environmental issues, or even to suppress bass for that matter. And that starts with good stewardship and good citizens. And so they've been a foundation of all this work through the class group, the Cultus Lake Aquatic Stewards. And I can't speak highly enough about how effective that interplay between multiple levels of government and citizens on action is. So Cultus Lake itself is a fairly small system. It's a sockeye salmon nursery lake. You're seeing multi-bait beam bathymetry on the right there. It's not very deep. It's about somewhere between 35 and 45 meters deep, depending on where you are in the lake. And it sits kind of, it's kind of this beautiful aquamarine blue from the surface. Typically, people equate their experience here with being a true nature experience. And of course, from the federal level, I get involved. I'm within DFO's science branch, so we tend to do research and monitoring around aquatic habitats, around aquatic species that touch tidewater specifically. Otherwise, it's usually a provincial jurisdiction. So anadromous salmon fit that bill, and of course, species at risk fit that bill, which the lake has two. There's many more in the catchment, Pacific giant salamander, weird bryophytes, and things like that. But in the lake itself, one of the poster children for endangerment of salmon in Canada has unfortunately been the Cultus Lake Sockeye salmon, which is currently before the minister for listing. Posiwick in 2017 suggested it be listed as endangered, and so the minister's looking at this along with 70% of the populations of Fraser sockeye. And the pygmy sculpin actually is on Schedule 1 of SARA. It's protected as threatened, and the minister is currently upgrading that to endangered, specifically because of it only exists in this one system. It's kind of this weird parallel evolution where riverine species started migrating up and down in a water column like a sockeye. And so it's unique to Cultus Lake. There's some parallel evolution examples, but this is going to be endangered soon, just simply because of the pressures being put on the system. Because it's a complex problem, you need to distill intent. And so from very early on, it became apparent that the quality of the water in the habitat is really what matters, right? So making sure that water quality is maintained at a nutrient level, at a productivity level, at a contaminant level that is useful for all values. And so when I speak to people in public seminars or even scientists, everybody ties to a different value, whether it's your cultural value, recreation, as I said, is huge, $100 million industry, basically, or the species at risk. It all ties to preserving that water quality. And as we noted, that lake water quality is not easy to figure out. That's what I was mentioning earlier. That's why we've been struggling with species at risk. And so those outcomes are not just what's happening in the aquatic sphere. I don't tell this group, you seem to be biologically minded, that aquatic ecosystems exist within watersheds. And because of this coupling and broader couplings, they're excellent, lakes in particular, excellent sentinels of environmental change. They can tell us a lot about what's happening in an area. So up to the 90s, the science really stopped there, but really we know there are bigger processes like regional processes in our world, like El Nino, La Nina cycles, Pacific decadal oscillation cycles, other overlying perhaps airshed issues, and then tie in, of course, global processes like climate change. All these things interact at all these spatial and temporal levels to affect the biotic and abiotic conditions within a lake. And so this really is a complex bag, and it's been a wonderful system to work on, even though it's a pretty depressing sort of message and feel. So I gave a longer version of this at the BC Lake Stewardship Society meeting here, this last annual general meeting. And it was named the Big Three. And they're talking about agents of change in aquatic systems and specifically lakes in BC. What are the major agents of change? Well, turns out eutrophication, or artificial nutrient enrichment, that we can check the box there at Cultus. Shuswap Lake would be a similar example of unconstrained nutrient releases into a lake. For reference, they've had to close beaches in Cultus Lake for E. coli, and in Salmon Arm in August of 2022 for the entire month. They shut down all the recreational opportunities in that area because of concerns over ingestion and exposure to aquatic toxins coming from cyanobacteria. So some of this is interactive, right? Of course, climate change is modifying all aquatic ecosystems, all hydrologies on the planet, and so that is to some extent some directional change. It all in this region that interacts heavily with the decadal oscillations and El Nino type dynamics. But what the group here today is most interested in is these introduced species, and so they're increasing. This is a provincial stat. They're increasing at an alarming rate, really, within BC, and as you saw from Amalis's presentation, there's a great diversity of them, largely coming from the aquarium industry, but certainly translocation of native species in Canada is a real problem, and we're talking about smallmouth bass today. So, this has been 15 years of my career trying to figure out what the heck's going on in Cultus Lake, and it keeps like curveballs just keep getting thrown at us. Like climate change doubled in the last 10 years, and now we have bass invading that are clearing out the lake, and so it's this. I coined the phrase aqua incognita, like terra incognita, but we really don't know what's going to happen, right? That can, with trophic cascades and other sort of ecological dynamics, this could end up being quite a curious ecosystem that we try to manage and don't get it right. So it truly is becoming a wicked problem for multiple levels of government and Indigenous nations in the Lower Mainland. And part of that problem is its proximity to this large population and what we do to the landscape, right? So most of the winds are westerly. You can see where Cultus Lake fits into that equation. So if that's true, then most of this air mass is moving whatever's in it over this way. Also, this is where your 3 million visitors are coming from a year, plus, what we do to this landscape, I'll talk about that later, really seems to be impacting the lake. So it's really a proximity problem and an airshed problem in large quantity, but we can't be naive and don't think that climate change isn't a big part of the problem here. And so this is where, I tend to lose some people, but I think it's really important the data speaks for itself here. Cultus Lake is completely and utterly controlled by the atmosphere in terms of its physical structure, and then its cascading effects on biology and chemistry in the ecosystem. So this is the relationship between climate data I should note that I wrote, or I led the Cultus Lake Sockeye Recovery Potential Assessment for the Minister. And so some of this is published in there, and I can certainly disseminate any of the publications to those that are interested. So this is just showing basically a 1 month lead lag relationship, very strong, between air temperatures and heating in the upper water column of Cultus Lake. Each one of those is a value taken from a discrete limnological sampling that we've done over that period. And on the right, you can see that manifests into lake stability, which really, for many lakes now, the problem is that when stratification steps up, that hotter water overlying colder water, there's a really strong density separation. So it becomes kind of an immiscible quantity until air cooling cools that down in the fall. And what we're finding is the length of stratification in many lakes in BC is extending, especially warm monomictic coastal lakes like Cultus. And that means both earlier advanced stratification in the spring and later destratification in the fall. These are major and fundamental changes for lakes. So because those relationships were so strong, we tied the relationship to the air temperature record. And you can see very distinctly since about the mid-1970s, there's been this sort of directional warming. Yes, we do see the interannual variability at Cultus, but it's heading to a warmer state. And it's unlikely that that's to reverse, right? So let's talk about eutrophication, the other major driver of change in the system. On the left, you'll see an algal bloom that happened in Cultus Lake that was taken from the main beach in January of this year. We never, ever see, until this happened, algal blooms in the middle of winter. And I have my suspicions. We need to look at the data to figure out exactly what's going on here. But this is not algae proper, right? This is a cyanobacteria. These are the organisms that both gave oxygen to the planet and have taken it away in 2 mass extinctions. So they're kind of a primordial thing that can do well when others can't. And so the interesting component here, this is all an Anabina bloom. So you see the species under the microscope here, different cells. It's a colonial type arrangement, or filamentous type arrangement. And they actually have these little vacuoles, you can see it here in the microscope picture, where they can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. So anytime nitrogen becomes limiting in the system, you typically see, these sorts of nitrogen fixing cyanobacteria increasing. Here we see a bloom in January, very unsightly. Picture that in the middle of summer with respect to recreational values in the system. Yeah, you can imagine that would be quite a disconnect. Turns out it's poor for the ecology as well. And that didn't work out at all. Basically, it ties to nitrogen and phosphorus levels in the lake and the relative ratio of the two. So we have many lines of evidence that suggest the lake is undergoing cultural eutrophication or artificial nutrient enrichment. Here's, just one line from a recent paper we had on the system where we looked at sediment cores and dated them, and were able to show when and how the watershed changed and how the lake has changed. And so you can see from the late 1800s until about 1950, the lake was very static, low productivity in terms of overall inferred algal abundance. And then something changed, right? And this something is tied to, you have to read the paper, but changes in agricultural practices, changes in local development at the lake, like it really boomed then for recreation, poor constraints on septics and how we deal with human waste, et cetera, cumulative effects problem that's led to a much more productive lake than it ever would have been otherwise. And so that it's worth stopping to note that, so we've talked about two drivers thus far, climate change and eutrophication, both pushing this towards a system that would be a better recipient ecosystem for smallmouth bass. And, people go there, they say, this is my wilderness experience, but they don't understand what's going on underneath the waterline. And so, very quickly, the nitrogen depletes in the seasonal cycle in the top of the water column. We're just looking down here from top of the water to the bottom. And you'll see that these deep chlorophyll maxima exist right at that transition between the warm and cold water. And that they're just able to make use of large stores of deep water nutrients, and specifically nitrogen. And you can see right where that happens, it supersaturates the water column with oxygen. We have distant historical data to compare with. That seems to be a slight feature of the past, obviously not as pronounced as it is. So this is the result of algal productivity. But what's really concerning for us in species at risk world is what's happening down the bottom of the lake. And that's just basically, as all this excess organic matter is raining down, it's being decomposed. That decomposition is typically an aerobic process, which leads to oxygen deficits for species at risk in the critical habitat. And of course, these two drivers are completely interactive. The warmer it gets, it tends to be that lakes are and aquatic ecosystems are more productive, right? You've probably all walked around the sloughs of the Fraser Valley and saw a good scuzz in the late summer on top. So you're producing a lot more of sloughs. You're producing a lot more cyanobacteria, more nutrients. The temperature constraints on aquatic fauna make their metabolisms increase. So you get more small fish, which is typically what anglers are looking for, et cetera, et cetera. A whole whack of feedbacks that make this a complex situation, why you need to constrain these types of variables to understand critical habitat change and recipient and ecosystem change for invasions. So I mentioned that the physics is now forced by climate. I'm going to show you the chemistry and the biology are as well. So on the left, you see the relationship between photosynthetic rates, which is a very specialized analysis that my program does, where we actually take light and dark bottles from different layers within the lake that are tuned to a light profile. And then we spike them with radioisotope of carbon-14, and then we measure the uptake of that carbon-14 over a known time period. Because we use that information in fisheries models and other things, but it's really a good sense of the metabolism of the lake. And as you can see here, as it gets warmer, the lake is more productive. That's essentially the relationship. So all that organic matter raining down is greater at the bottom of the lake, et cetera. And therefore the oxygen sucked up is worse. And you can see it's totally driven by this loss of nitrogen here in the upper water column. And we've even published that it's inducing these cyanobacterial events that last over quite a period of time. And so all you need to do is dial up that temperature, and you can think about where climate change is going, or change the hydrology of the system, or the nutrients loading become larger, and we've got an algal bowl essentially on our hands here. So where does this habitat degradation that we've now been pointing out for 15 years and really very little's been done about it leave species at risk, to be frank? Because that's my organization's most critical concern. And as it turns out, sockeye are pretty hardwired organisms. So the juvenile sockeyes try to maximize their feeding opportunities while minimizing their predation potential, right? Being predated upon by an abundant guild of piscivores within the lake. And so in the daytime, they're basically hugging the water, the sediments at the bottom of Cultus Lake. And in the nighttime, they come up to the upper water column to feed. The problem is that latter part during the day when they're trying to avoid predation, and they're right down in this area, the water column where oxygen is becoming very low. And turns out sockeye are kind of the wimps of the oxygen tolerance world. They have a really strong survival climb, somewhere between 2.5 and 3 milligrams of oxygen. And if you lay those thresholds on, this is just monitoring data from the bottom of Cultus Lake, like at 40 meters roughly, just above the sediment water interface. And you can see that over the seasonal cycle, it goes down to very low levels. Then when the lake mixes, it goes back up, down. And some of these minima are approaching like completely anoxic levels, which unfortunately initiates a whole suite of problems for the lake. Like you start actually internally loading more nutrients from the bottom of the sediments under those conditions, which makes the problem, of course, worse. It's a positive feedback, and the oxygen therefore gets worse, right? So this is a system that's likely to need active intervention, something such as a oxygenation system to preserve these values. And tying back to the earlier conception that everything's tied to water quality, you can imagine what recreation at this lake would be like if it turned pea green and stayed that way, right? Like it would be a complete shift in people's value system. I'm sure that would have negative impacts. But the one little fish that is protected in the lake because it's listed by the minister is this one, the pygmy sculpin. And so we don't have as great a picture on them. We do hydroacoustics and midwater trawling for the sockeye, but we have to take different approaches with these organisms because they're mainly on the bottom and then they come up into the water column to feed. They don't have a swim bladder like a sockeye. They can't hold neutral buoyancy. They're kind of like a shark. They have to keep swimming to feed. So it's a cost benefit of energetics versus what you take in. And so what we're finding is that they're not in the bottom of the lake during the times where they're typically found, during the times when oxygen is at its lowest. And so this maybe a few things, maybe they're becoming lethargic and don't enter the traps that we're using, or they're dying, or they're simply avoiding that area. They're moving up to a higher climb where the oxygen conditions are better. The problem is, of course, there's a top limit of that at the upper end of the hypolimnion, or that colder water parcel, that once the oxygen's gone, it's gone, right? And so the problem's already emerging now. And the future doesn't look great, right? Like, so most the hottest agricultural literature that I've seen for Fraser Valley is looking at changing to viticulture, changing to grapes. So to borrow a climate context, Kelowna type weather here in your lifetime in the conceivable near future. And so that means a lot hotter, right? You can see what the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal looks like there. By 2050, we're more or less double that in BC, plus or minus. And then by 2080, it's just going to be super hot here, right? And the average value for BC in the bottom right there could be 6 degrees above baseline, as high as 7.5 degrees above baseline. Well, those are apocalyptic scenarios if that ever comes to pass. But we've already come a long way, and so the upper right-hand graph shows you that there's been massive warming throughout the province in most seasons already. So species have already had to adapt to that, and then we're going to push them further. So I had a really bright master's student at UBC that I worked with, and we modeled we instrumented the Cultus Lake with a bunch of moorings with temperature sensors all over the place, and we were able to basically model the seasonal cycle very accurately. And then where he was super brilliant, this guy tied it to a global climate model that was downscaled for the valley, like still the same model they're using in the IPCC assessments, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so depending on what warming scenario you choose, he forecasted what the lake would look like. And it just keeps, basically, because Cultus Lake doesn't form ice, it doesn't get cold in the winter anymore, the lake year after year just keeps storing heat. And that's a problem for the seasonal cycle in the lake. And so the next student along, also equally brilliant, was able to find the relationship between that lake heating, warmth in the empirical data, and what the oxygen conditions are at the bottom of the lake. Because microbes too are, the oxygen sucking up microbes are also metabolically constrained by temperature. So linking it to the model I showed you before, the bottom plot here shows the habitat restriction for that endangered species out over the future, again tied to a global climate model. And what you get is, these surface waters in Cultus Lake approach 28 degrees now. I've seen almost as high as 30 degrees, which is like hot, right? Way too hot for a salmon to survive. In fact, that threshold's around 18 to 20. And then of course the low oxygen climb starts coming up from the bottom. And so this is where that transition zone would be between hot and cold parcels, but you can see the oxygen starts to suck up the solution space. So this is a problem that will require And I guess it's worth noting we always get the rates of climate change and the impacts. We always underestimate them, it seems. So, some of this stuff could be way more rapid than we're able to prognosticate based on the information we have. So, early on to me in the problem, early 2010s, where are these nutrients coming from? So we put my first grad student at SFU on, Nika Putt, and we measured all the tributaries to Cultus, the channelized tributaries, and then estimated sheet flow for the other areas. And they were then clustered. You can see these different colors: so Lindell Beach, International Ridge, Smith Falls Creek, and Vetter Mountain drainages, all of course spatially aggregated, but they also had similar chemical and physical properties, hydrological properties. So they basically zoned out into loads. We were able to monitor the chemistry every 2 weeks of these streams and the hydrology, which gave us loading to the lake. And this is the annual result of all that work, which is to say that we identified a number of defined sources for phosphorus and nitrogen that input loads to the lake of significance, and for phosphorus really septic leachate, which is actually this work. I should laud the successes. This work has actually pushed the regional district and the province into better than municipal standard treatment sewage facility for the southern end of the lake, or the northern end of the lake rather, which was a direct result of Lake First thinking based on results like this. So we're tackling the sewage inputs, right, slowly, but there's a huge population of gulls that come in the fall and stay till spring, and they go to the Fraser Valley and eat all day, and then they come back in the lake and do their business at night and eutrophy the lake, believe it or not. And so we were able to constrain that with clicker counts and guano estimates and all this sort of stuff, but there's not much we can do about that, right? Because they are protected under international conventions. So then we looked at, of course, all the loadings from the sub-watersheds here, and you can see one of them in particular, Columbia Valley, is high for both nitrogen and phosphorus. This is a legacy agricultural catchment. While it drains straight out of the U.S. and is pristine where it does, the valley bottom has like 100 and some odd years of agricultural legacy, so it picks up quite a bit of nutrients as it's coming down. However, you see how atmospheric depositions are low values for both of these. These are just on the wetted boundaries of Cultus Lake. And so the crazy thing is, when you discount the defined sources and add up these subwatershed inputs, they're largely driven by atmospheric sources of nutrients, not something coming from the land or the water, coming from the air itself. And so I'll walk you through how that goes. On the left-hand side, so watershed runoff is the largest contributor of either nutrient, nitrogen or phosphorus. But the Cultus Lake funnel, because Vetter Mountain's quite a bit lower than International Ridge, or Cultus Lake watershed rather, is like a funnel because Vetter Mountain's lower, International Ridge is higher, and those nutrients end up, whether they're particulate or they're condensed or whatever happened, whatever process is driving it, they're coming from the atmosphere. And so when you look at the total loads to the lake, 65% of the nitrogen and 42% of the phosphorus is actually airborne nutrients. And that just blows people's minds that are working on other ecological processes. But it's true, we monitored it. So here's some of that data, those data. So since the study, we've kept going. I should update the series. Seasonal cycle of concentration data of phosphorus and nitrogen in rainwater at my lab, which is within the Cultus Lake Basin. And you can see that, certainly during the agricultural period, whether that's because of temperature for nitrogen or probably tilling and erosion for phosphorus, we see, elevated levels in wet deposition. Like you should never see ammonia values that's high in rainwater, like not at all, like almost below detection limit. So a lot of this is driven by what's around us, right? And so we exist within the Fraser Valley airshed. This is it's been given special airshed status. If anybody remembers the waste to energy stuff where Vancouver is going to burn its garbage and then send it our way in the airshed, this is the primary concern here. And all things that are produced upwind, of course, relative to the predominantly westerly flow, end up being transported to the Eastern Valley. That's why Hope has some terrible air quality measurements from time to time. And these implications, these chemicals, this isn't just phosphorus and nitrogen. This is chemical congeners that you and I probably couldn't pronounce, right? That come from industrial processes, etc. And they could in fact be having impacts from valley bottom to mountaintop. That's actually being looked in by local indigenous groups. That's really cool. But it requires, unfortunately, this complex watershed to airshed management. So again, we're layering on the interjurisdictional pieces, making it more of a complex problem or a wicked problem. So where do the nutrients ultimately come from? Well, they don't just end up in our air, because if you take measurements outside the airshed, they're basically back to pristine values. So this is all coming from emissions from the land principally. That nitrous oxides and things like that can come from transportation, but largely what we're talking about, the ammonia, the nitrate, the phosphorus, is coming from enriched sources. So urban burning, development of urban areas upwind of Cultus Lake, and of course the agricultural footprint, right? And so for phosphorus, that has to be dust principally, because you have to heat phosphorus to 280 degrees Celsius to change state. So it has to be basically tilling, wind erosion, unkept fields, and biomass burning to some extent as well. In fact, there are large quantities of waste food burned in Burnaby that could be part of this picture as well. And it's not like nobody's looked at it. Like, so Environment Canada and the US EPA looked at this back in 2014 and started to draw attention to it. It's just, this is a major issue that requires targeted action. And I don't necessarily think the continuity has been there. But you can see that Cultus Lake is right in this big red hotspot. And this is the modeling data for deposition of nitrogen. And this is modeling that same modeling data with some lichenometry. So they took these lichens, right, and they looked at how much nitrogen was in the thallus, or the vegetative structures of the lichen. They were able to show hot deposition zones. So, we've messed up the lot water in the land, so we've also messed up the air, right? And the problem with these nutrients is that it's not just poisoning, it can be that, but it's ecosystem modification and stimulation, right? And not all Pacific ecosystems were born to be highly productive. So then somebody goes and dunks these things in there, right? And we don't really understand the provenance of what happened, but like, they're not around here very, to any great extent. I think maybe Chadsey Lake or something in Abbotsford has smallmouth bass. Most anglers prefer largemouth bass, but so they're here and they're warm water fish, and Cultus is getting warmer and more productive. So we don't fully understand what they're going to do to the ecosystem, but we have some pretty good indicators, which is why folks like Amalis and myself and local stewards and indigenous nations are trying to pull out the stops to deal with this problem. It could be a radiative expansion problem to the rest of the province, or lower mainland at least. And it's very complex. And so part of what's going on in the background academically with monitoring what's happening here is trying to understand angler intention, the complexities of the social realm on what you're trying to manage, which is suppression of this species here. So again, the backdrop's complex, and then we'll add the human element to it. So more aqua incognita, I think, I'm afraid. Wendy Margetts, one of Brian Heisey's students at Thompson Rivers University, did her master's thesis trying to describe smallmouth bass invasion of Cultus Lake. And so it's a largely descriptive study, but very useful in telling us a few things. Number one, smallmouth bass are eating species at risk. And that's a problem, right? Both federally and provincially. And so we need to be thinking about that critically. They also are eating a ton of other things out of the near shore of Cultus Lake. And so this is where it gets kind of scary. Our lab has been at Cultus Lake since the 1920s, I believe, maybe even a little bit earlier than that. Not as DFO, but as the Fisheries Research Board of Canada, a progenitor organization, still the feds. And so we have data that goes back quite a ways, and certainly our same dating of the near shore of Cultus doesn't go back that far. We have data back to 91. But essentially there's 16 sites, and there are only certain ones are shown here that are bar graphed around the edge of Cultus Lake, where technicians will go out with a seine, right, and catch all the near shore fish. So that could be your juvenile salmon, could be your sculpin, your pygmy, not pygmy necessarily, but sculpins, all the quote unquote coarse fish like red-side shiner, sticklebacks, chubs, northern pike minnow. And, in the 90s, you'd see basically a very diverse assemblage. These are number of fish on the y-axis here, a very diverse assemblage around the lake, depending on where you were. Obviously, some areas more productive than others. And then, carried back on by another scientist, Mike Bradford, in the mid-2000s. And then one of our biologists in my team picked it up again in 2015. And what you can start to see is that 2015 looks quite a bit different than the past, while variable in the past. And there are other sites that build this interpretation. But then we went in recently, and there was nothing left in the nearshore. In fact, where we would have collected thousands of fish in one seine, we're now getting like 100 fish, and a big chunk of them now are either benthic sculpins or smallmouth bass. We've also now noted that there's invasive pumpkin seed sunfish in the lake as well, which is a real problem, right? So now we're into ecosystem transformation. What does this mean, right? All of a sudden, we've taken away a top-down impact on a nearshore environment. God knows what that means. We should be studying this, but we can only monitor as the invasion happens and do our best to suppress it. But this level of change, which basically between 2015 and 2023, so about 8 years, is a radical ecological change for a lake that was becoming more productive and basically should have a higher nearshore community here. Plus, you have all the milfoil, right? So, just to summarize, Cultus Lake has been a wonderful, place for me to have landed as a scientist and start looking at complex environmental science issues. We were able to define using multiple approaches: paleolinology, how did we get here, mechanistic science between the linology, or the physical, chemical, and biological monitoring of the lake, and species at risk monitoring, the sockeye and the sculpin, and really putting it back into a context with an engaged stewardship group. And this is where I really want to laud with this talk, is it's so important for ENGOs and the government to work together. And while that hasn't always been facilitated in the past, the outcomes can just be so much richer. So one of them is class here locally, of course. Fraser Valley Watershed Coalition's been a huge part of this work too, getting the word out. But these are huge, complex problems, even one little ecosystem here, right? That really need monitoring and science to deal with. So from the Fed's perspective, it's species at risk. From people with $1 million foreshore properties, it's is my place going to be worth as much, if this thing turns pea green? So, it requires elegant monitoring and science, but also like outreach and dissemination to a huge component, right? Interjurisdictional and interdisciplinary cooperation between levels of government and science. It really does take a village, right? And so, the problem is, of course, once you think you got things figured out in terms of where the ecosystem is going or where the values are going, somebody dumps smallmouth bass in there. And I really think that these interactions are going to lead to interesting but concerning ecological interactions, because Cultus is not the only lake receiving bass or invasive species. It's not the only lake in BC that's eutrophying. In fact, many of them are, and losing their oxygen. And so, this level of data we've been able to put in here is actually affecting action. But we need other sites around the province where this stuff's occurring to understand really what it means for different biogeoclimatic contexts with different ecosystems, right? And so, unfortunately, the uncontrolled experiment is the introduction of invasive species, but we really should be looking at their impacts on the habitat very, very intensively, using them as case studies, because as people become more numerous in this province, want to move species around at their own discretion. Just because it's illegal doesn't mean it's becoming any less frequent, right? In fact, it's increasing. So just wanted to thank a bunch of people and groups for their continued involvement in the science around Cultus. And happy, like Amalis said, to entertain any questions that we can.
Lovely. Thank you, Dr. Selbie and Amalis, for your presentations here. It's a pretty remarkable place, it seems, Cultus. And a couple of questions here. I'm sure there may be sort of more to pop in, but one that came in was, how do you determine dissolved oxygen for the 1930s? Was that recorded back then and you just have access to it, or?
Yeah, so there were no probes for DO back then, right? No membranes, none of that stuff. So back in the day, like very early on, I think this came more from the ocean literature than the freshwater literature, but Winkler titrations is what they're called because Winkler came up with them way back when. But it's essentially you convert the dissolved oxygen into a precipitate as part of the process. We did this in school. It's actually way more accurate than a probe, believe it or not, if you do it correctly. And so that's how it was done back in the day. Ricker, during his PhD, so he's probably Canada's most preeminent fisheries scientist, did his PhD on the limnology of Cultus Lake and was doing that technique.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. I guess, yeah, for both of you, I'm assuming you work together a bit, and I guess with so many of the stressors in Cultus Lake, what are the sort of priority actions to help sockeye and sculpin? What are the sort of low-hanging fruit you can attack now, and maybe what are the long-term priorities?
From our standpoint, kill bass, right? Like, and so Species at Risk Act secretary. It sounds harsh, right? Because we're all biologists here, but or nature lovers. But the potential for that to be so transformative is we need every volunteer that wants to be part of this scene helping out in the bass front. On the nutrient front, those are bigger picture questions. You saw that the majority of it's coming from the airshed. So we've actually held a technical workshop called the Air We Share with all airshed people, as well as the environmental ministries and Indigenous nations, to try and start to push that towards governance. So that's what we're doing at the local level, though. Advocacy around keeping this issue alive is a massive need. What I find is the more evidence you bring to a problem, the more issue fatigue society has with it, and the less likely they are to engage in that, right? And we all have attention spans, et cetera. So locally, if you live in the catchment, be thinking about your nutrient management on your property, of course, right? Like, so lawn fertilizers, how up to date is your septic? Are you hooking up to the sewerage system that's being put in? But certainly from this group's perspective and any sort of the ENGO stuff, bringing the attention to cultus, it's dangerous here. Maybe Amalis can speak to this, because like as an invasive species council, we can say it has to be all hands on deck with cultus and it's bass, right? But that might bring anglers that want to then move them to Chilliwack Lake or Lake X or Y, right? So did you have anything you want to mention on that, Amalis? That's been an eye opener for me, certainly in the management of that piece.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance to navigate. I think education is a big one. I know it sounds like, very not a lot of biological effect on it, like you want action, you want to remove the bass, remove the invasives or prevent them. But a big part of prevention is education and outreach, and hopefully even those anglers who are very passionate and really want angling opportunities, like if they understand the impact that this has, maybe they might be less inclined or less motivated to actually move the invasive species to this lake or other lakes. And yeah, it is definitely a tricky balance, but that is a big one, is how to deal with the human factor, and how to disincentivize and demotivate and inspire people to want to protect the native ecosystems, and not to contribute to, adding stressors and adding challenges.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I noticed a fishing with rod image in your PowerPoint there. Is that an avenue, working with influencers like that to sort of spread the word?
I think it has to be a critical element of it. I really do, because to be perfectly honest, when I watch his videos about smallmouth bass, I want more smallmouth bass everywhere, right? And so I'm pretty sure that's not the intention he's suggesting out of his advocacy, right? Like, he talks about, ecological impacts and things like that, but it isn't necessarily the message that people get from the outreach, right? And so I think it's critical that we align our messages here. Like, think about what a voracious territorial piscivore could do in all Pacific little lakes around here. It could, that could basically nullify any of the Freshwater Fisheries Society translocations of their own, and fisheries for recreational fisheries. I mean, species at risk. Like, this is a real issue, especially aquatic invasives, right?
Definitely. There is one more question, but I'm seeing we're at 2 o'clock here. I'd like to respect everyone's time. But first, yeah, I have to really thank Amalis and Dan for spending their time to speak with us today. I'm sure if anyone has follow-up questions, I'm sure we can connect you, but please do that. Yeah, I just need to plug, remember to clean, drain, dry, and don't let it loose. And please do report, whether that's the Report Invasives app or through our respective websites or emails. Yeah, please do. And yeah, also I have to thank the Pacific Salmon Foundation for working with us here. And yeah, thanks to Megan for coordinating us here. Any final words, Amalis or Dan?
I just responded to the 2 questions in the chat. They were fairly straightforward. I just want to thank the opportunity and anything you can do to get the word out regarding these issues in a sort of responsible way is huge for us. So I'm hoping that the society and the integrated bass piece has good sort of interconnections coming up here, because we could certainly use your help.
Thank you so much for having us and for the opportunity of speaking.
Great.
Yeah, look forward to working together with you more on this issue. Anyway, thanks very much, everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and yeah, we'll see you in another webinar in the future. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.